Welcome to Lesson 10 of Week 8. The distinction between equipment and supplies is more than a budgeting technicality. This classification affects prior approval requirements, tracking obligations, and disposition rules at grant closeout. Understanding the distinction helps you classify purchases correctly and manage them appropriately throughout your project. Equipment is defined by cost threshold and useful life criteria. Items meeting these criteria carry special requirements that supplies do not. Misclassifying purchases can create compliance problems ranging from inadequate tracking to improper disposition of grant-funded property. This lesson will help you understand the regulatory definition of equipment and supplies, how to classify purchases correctly using the threshold criteria, the special requirements that apply to equipment, and best practices for managing both equipment and supplies on your grants. Remember that specific thresholds discussed were accurate as of November 2025. Thresholds can change, and you should verify current requirements at ecfr.gov before making classification decisions. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to distinguish equipment from supplies and understand the implications of each classification. Equipment has a specific regulatory definition that determines when special requirements apply. Understanding this definition enables proper classification of purchases. The federal definition of equipment is tangible personal property, including information technology systems, having a useful life of more than 1 year and a per-unit acquisition cost equal to or exceeding the capitalization threshold established by the organization or the federal threshold, whichever is lower. The federal cost threshold was $5,000 per unit as of November 2025. Items costing $5,000 or more with a useful life exceeding 1 year are classified as equipment. Your organization may have a lower threshold that also applies. Use whichever threshold is lower. Both criteria must be met for equipment classification. An item costing $10,000 but with a useful life of 6 months is not equipment because it fails the useful life test. An item lasting 10 years but costing $3,000 is not equipment because it falls below the cost threshold. Only items meeting both criteria are equipment. 2 CFR 200.1 defines equipment for federal grants. Verify the current threshold at ecfr.gov, as the threshold may have been adjusted. Using an outdated threshold could cause misclassification with compliance implications. Supplies is the category for tangible property that does not meet the equipment definition. Understanding what qualifies as supplies helps you classify purchases correctly. Supplies are defined as tangible personal property that does not meet the equipment threshold. This broad category includes everything from office materials to laboratory consumables to minor equipment items that fall below the equipment cost threshold. Items with per unit cost below $5,000, or whatever the current threshold is, are supplies regardless of useful life. A $4,000 computer lasting 5 years is supplies because it falls below the cost threshold. A $2,000 piece of lab equipment is supplies for the same reason. Items with useful life of 1 year or less are supplies regardless of cost. Consumable reagents that cost $6,000 but will be used within 6 months are supplies because they fail the useful life criterion. The cost alone does not determine classification. Both criteria must be evaluated. Consumables, items used up in the course of research, are typically supplies. Lab reagents, office materials, and other items that get consumed through use generally fall into the supplies category. Their nature as consumables inherently suggests useful life shorter than 1 year. The equipment versus supplies distinction matters because equipment carries special requirements that supplies do not. Understanding these implications helps you manage purchases appropriately. Prior approval from the federal awarding agency is often required before equipment purchases. Check your award terms for specific requirements. Purchasing equipment without required approval can result in disallowed costs even when the equipment was legitimately needed for the project. Tracking requirements apply to equipment throughout your project and beyond. You must maintain an inventory of equipment purchased with grant funds, including information about acquisition date, cost, location, condition, and ultimate disposition. These records must be accessible for review. Disposition rules govern what happens to equipment when your grant ends. Depending on circumstances, you may continue using equipment for its original purpose, transfer it to another project, or follow specific disposition procedures. Understanding these rules early helps you plan appropriately. Equipment is excluded from the modified total direct cost base for indirect cost calculation. Supplies are included in MTDC. This difference affects the total indirect costs generated by your budget. Large equipment purchases reduce your MTDC and consequently your indirect cost charges. Working through classification examples helps solidify understanding of how the criteria apply. Consider how each factor affects the determination. An $8,000 microscope is equipment because it exceeds the cost threshold and has a useful life well beyond 1 year. Both criteria are met, so this is equipment with all associated requirements. A $3,500 computer is supplies despite having a useful life of several years. The cost falls below the $5,000 threshold, so the item does not meet the equipment definition regardless of how long it will last. A $7,000 reagent kit is supplies despite exceeding the cost threshold. Because the reagents will be consumed within the project year, the useful life criterion is not met. Cost alone does not make something equipment. Edge cases require careful analysis. If you purchase components that will be assembled into a system, is the relevant cost per component or for the assembled system? If you upgrade existing equipment, does the upgrade constitute new equipment? These situations require thoughtful application of the criteria and may warrant consultation with your grants office. Equipment purchases frequently require prior approval from the federal awarding agency. Understanding this requirement prevents compliance problems. Check your award terms for equipment approval requirements. Requirements vary by agency and program. Some awards require approval for any equipment purchase. Others allow equipment up to certain amounts without approval. Know what your specific award requires before purchasing. The request process involves submitting written requests before committing funds. Contact your program officer or follow your agency's established procedures for prior approval requests. Provide complete information about what you want to purchase and why. Your justification should explain why the equipment is necessary for project success. Why do you need this specific item? Why can existing equipment not serve the purpose? How will the equipment advance project objectives? Strong justification demonstrates thoughtful planning and genuine need. Allow time for agency review before your planned purchase date. Prior approval requests take time to process. Submitting a request days before you need to purchase creates problems. Plan ahead and submit requests with adequate lead time for review and response. Equipment purchased with grant funds must be tracked throughout its useful life. Understanding tracking requirements helps you maintain compliance. Property records must maintain an inventory of all grant-funded equipment. This inventory should be current, accurate, and accessible. Many organizations use automated asset management systems, but manual records are also acceptable if properly maintained. Required information in equipment records includes a description of the equipment, manufacturer's serial number or other identification, source of funding including grant number, acquisition date, cost, location, condition, and ultimate disposition when the item is retired or transferred. Physical inventory should be conducted periodically to verify equipment existence and condition. Annual physical inventories are common. Comparing physical inventory results to records identifies missing items or discrepancies requiring investigation and resolution. Control systems safeguard equipment and prevent unauthorized use. Equipment should be used for project purposes, not diverted to unrelated activities or personal use. Adequate physical controls and usage policies protect equipment investments and ensure appropriate utilization. Equipment disposition rules govern what happens to grant-funded equipment when your project ends. Understanding these rules helps you plan appropriately for equipment you purchase. During the grant period, equipment should be used for project purposes. Equipment purchased for one grant should not be diverted to unrelated projects or activities without proper authorization. Keep equipment focused on the purposes for which it was acquired. At grant closeout, specific disposition rules apply. The federal awarding agency may have continuing interest in equipment purchased with grant funds. Disposition procedures depend on factors including the equipment's current fair market value and whether you have other federally funded projects that could use it. Options for disposition typically include continuing to use the equipment for other federally supported projects, transferring the equipment to another eligible party, or disposing of the equipment and returning any applicable share of proceeds to the federal government. The specific procedures depend on circumstances and award terms. 2 CFR 200.313 governs equipment disposition for federal grants. Review this regulation and your award terms to understand what procedures apply to equipment on your specific grant. Planning for eventual disposition helps you make appropriate decisions throughout the equipment's life. Equipment is budgeted as a separate category with specific justification requirements. Understanding these expectations helps you prepare strong equipment budgets. Equipment is typically listed as a separate budget category, distinct from supplies. This separation reflects the different requirements and implications of equipment purchases. List each piece of equipment with enough detail for reviewers to understand what you are requesting. Detailed descriptions should identify each equipment item and explain its purpose. Simply listing laboratory equipment at $50,000 does not give reviewers enough information. Specify the type of equipment, key specifications, and how it will be used in your project. Price basis documentation shows how you determined estimated costs. Did you obtain vendor quotes? Did you research prices online? Have you purchased similar equipment recently? Documenting your price basis demonstrates that estimates are reasonable rather than arbitrary. Justification explains why equipment is necessary and why existing equipment cannot meet the need. Reviewers want assurance that equipment requests are genuine necessities, not wish list items that would be nice to have. Explain specifically why the project requires this equipment and why sharing existing equipment is not feasible. Supplies budgeting is generally more flexible than equipment, but still requires thoughtful estimation and justification. Understanding expectations helps you prepare appropriate supply budgets. Supplies may be budgeted as a single line item or broken into subcategories depending on your project and funder preferences. Research grants often separate laboratory supplies from office supplies. Training grants might distinguish materials from general supplies. Use categories that make sense for your project. Base estimates on anticipated project needs rather than convenient round numbers. Consider what activities you will conduct, what materials those activities require, and what quantities you will realistically use. Estimates grounded in project plans are more defensible than arbitrary figures. Typical supply categories include office supplies for project administration, laboratory consumables for research activities, materials that become part of project outputs, and minor equipment below the threshold. The specific categories depend on your project type. Justification connects supply needs to project activities. While detailed item-by-item justification is not usually required for supplies, your budget narrative should explain the general categories and why projected amounts are appropriate for the proposed work. Several common errors affect equipment versus supplies classification. Recognizing these mistakes helps you classify purchases correctly. Threshold confusion involves using the wrong threshold amount. The federal threshold may change, and your organization may have a lower threshold. Verify current thresholds before making classification decisions. Using an outdated or incorrect threshold produces wrong classifications. Ignoring useful life focuses only on cost without considering the life criterion. Both factors must be evaluated. A high-cost item with short useful life is supplies. Classification requires analyzing both criteria, not just the more obvious cost factor. System components create classification questions when items are improperly separated to avoid thresholds. If you purchase components that together form a system costing more than the threshold, the system cost is relevant, not individual component costs. Artificially separating purchases to avoid equipment classification is improper. Organizational policy may establish thresholds lower than the federal threshold. If your institution capitalizes assets at $3,000, that threshold applies even though the federal threshold is higher. Always use the lower of federal or institutional thresholds for classification. Both equipment and supplies require appropriate management throughout your project. Good management practices support compliance and effective resource utilization. Procurement compliance requires following applicable purchasing requirements. Equipment purchases may require competitive bidding or specific procurement procedures. Even supply purchases should follow your organization's procurement policies. Noncompliance can create audit findings. Receipt and verification confirms that you received what you ordered and that items meet specifications. Check delivered items against orders and packing lists. Report discrepancies promptly. Verify that equipment functions properly before accepting delivery and releasing final payment. Storage and security protects both equipment and supplies appropriately. Equipment should be secured to prevent theft or unauthorized use. Supplies should be stored properly to prevent waste or damage. Good storage practices preserve the value of your grant-funded purchases. Usage tracking monitors consumption and helps you adjust future estimates. Are you using supplies faster or slower than expected? Is equipment being utilized as planned? Tracking usage helps you manage current resources and improve future budgeting accuracy. The equipment versus supplies distinction affects indirect cost calculations. Understanding this relationship helps you appreciate the full budget implications of each classification. Equipment is excluded from modified total direct costs for indirect cost calculation purposes. When you purchase $50,000 of equipment, that amount does not contribute to your MTDC and does not generate indirect costs. Supplies are included in MTDC. Supply purchases are part of the base for indirect cost calculation. $50,000 of supplies would be included in MTDC and would generate indirect costs at your applicable rate. This difference means equipment purchases reduce indirect cost charges compared to what equivalent supply purchases would generate. For organizations with 50% indirect cost rates, $50,000 of equipment generates zero indirect costs, while $50,000 of supplies generates $25,000 in indirect costs. Understanding how classification affects total costs helps you model budgets accurately. The direct cost amount is only part of the picture. Indirect cost implications should also be considered when planning major purchases. Following best practices for equipment and supplies ensures proper classification and compliance. These practices should guide your approach to purchasing on grants. Verify current thresholds before making classification decisions. Federal thresholds can change, and your organization may have lower thresholds. Using current, accurate thresholds produces correct classifications. Analyze both criteria when classifying purchases. Evaluate per unit cost and useful life for each significant purchase. Both criteria must be met for equipment classification. Focusing on only one criterion leads to errors. Follow applicable requirements based on classification. Equipment has prior approval, tracking, and disposition requirements that supplies do not have. Once you classify an item, comply with all requirements for that classification. Document thoroughly to support classification decisions and demonstrate compliance. Keep records showing why items were classified as equipment or supplies. Maintain equipment inventories and disposition records. Documentation protects you during audits and reviews. Let us summarize the key points from this lesson on equipment versus supplies. The distinction depends on both cost threshold and useful life. As of November 2025, items costing $5,000 or more per unit with useful life exceeding 1 year are equipment. Items failing either criterion are supplies. Verify current thresholds before classifying purchases. Equipment carries special requirements including prior approval for purchases, inventory tracking throughout the equipment's life, and specific disposition rules when grants end. Equipment is also excluded from MTDC for indirect cost calculation. Understanding and complying with these requirements is essential for equipment you purchase. Supplies have fewer formal requirements but still need proper management. Budget supplies based on realistic project needs, follow procurement procedures, and track usage to inform future estimates. While documentation requirements are less extensive than equipment, good records still support compliance. In our final lesson for this week, we explore how artificial intelligence tools can assist with budget calculations. AI can help model scenarios, check arithmetic, and accelerate budget preparation. but with important limitations you must understand. We will examine practical applications while emphasizing the need for human verification. Practice exercise. Review a recent equipment purchase or planned purchase on one of your grants. Was it properly classified? Were all required approvals obtained? Is it properly tracked in your equipment inventory?